Do you have any idea who you've just run into, sweetheart? The tall man whispered with a quiet laugh behind his mask. Nina Carter froze. A second earlier, she had been walking across the crowded ballroom of the Riverside Grand Restaurant, trying not to spill the glass of champagne in her hand. Music played softly from the small jazz band near the stage. Guests moved between tables, laughing and greeting one another as the New Year's Eve celebration carried on around them. Then she had collided directly into someone. Her heel slipped, the glass tilted. Before she could fall, a strong arm wrapped around her waist and steadied her. Nina's eyes widened behind her silver mask. Oh my God. I'm so sorry," she blurted quickly, clearly embarrassed. "I didn't see you there. I really didn't mean to." The man holding her did not let go immediately. His grip was firm but respectful, keeping her balanced until she regained her footing. "It's all right," he said calmly. His voice was deep and controlled, the kind of voice that naturally drew attention without trying. Only then did Nina realize how tall he was. Dressed in a perfectly tailored black tuxedo, wearing a dark silver mask that covered his eyes, he looked completely at ease in the middle of the elegant ballroom. Then he leaned slightly closer and said with quiet amusement, "Do you have any idea who you've just run into, sweetheart?" Nina blinked. For a moment, she simply stared at him, still flustered. Honestly, no," she admitted nervously. "But I promise it wasn't intentional." A small smile formed on his lips. "Well," he replied lightly. "That's disappointing." She frowned slightly. "Why?" "Because accidents are usually more interesting when someone plans them." Nina let out a small, awkward laugh. "Trust me, if I had planned that, I would have at least managed not to almost fall on my face." He chuckled quietly. "Well, for what it's worth, you recovered very gracefully." She looked down for a second, clearly embarrassed. "Thank you, I think." The music from the jazz band shifted into a slow, elegant tune. Couples began stepping toward the center of the dance floor. The man glanced briefly toward the musicians and then back at Nina. "Since we've already made such a memorable entrance," he said casually, "may I have the next dance?" Nina's eyes widened immediately. "Oh no. I mean..." She shook her head quickly. "I'm sorry, but I really don't dance." "You don't dance?" "Not well," she corrected, smiling awkwardly. "Actually, not at all." The man studied her for a moment as if deciding whether she was serious. Then he shrugged slightly. "That's all right. It is. I'll teach you." Nina laughed nervously. "You make that sound very easy." "It is easy. I'm pretty sure I would step on your shoes. That would be a risk I'm willing to take." She hesitated. The man extended his hand. His voice softened just a little. "One dance," he said. "If you hate it, you can blame me." Nina looked at his hand, then at the growing number of couples already moving slowly across the dance floor. Her heart was beating faster than she expected. Finally, she sighed softly. "Well, if I embarrass myself, this conversation never happened." He smiled. "Agreed." She placed her hand carefully in his. "Okay," she said quietly, "but you're responsible for everything that happens next. Fair warning accepted." He led her gently toward the center of the floor. The moment they stepped into the open space, he placed one hand lightly at her waist while guiding her other hand into position. "Relax," he said softly. "Just follow me." "I'm trying," Nina whispered. "Don't think too much. That's easy for you to say. Trust me." She took a slow breath. The music carried them forward. At first, Nina moved cautiously, unsure where her feet should go. But the man guided her effortlessly, his steps calm and precise. "See?" he murmured. "You're already dancing. That's because you're doing all the work. Leadership is an underrated skill." She laughed softly. After a few turns, she realized something surprising. She wasn't nervous anymore. The rhythm of the music felt natural. His movements were confident but gentle, guiding her without forcing anything. "You weren't kidding," she said quietly. "You really are teaching me. I try to keep my promises." As the dance continued, the two of them moved together with an unexpected elegance. Several guests near the edge of the floor began watching. The mysterious masked couple had suddenly become the most graceful pair in the room. Nina spun lightly beneath his arm. When she returned to him, the crowd nearby started clapping. She looked around in surprise. "Wait, why are they applauding?" "Because," he said calmly. "You're doing better than most of them." She shook her head, laughing. "That's impossible. Believe me." The applause grew louder. Several guests smiled and cheered as the music reached its final notes. When the song ended, the room burst into enthusiastic clapping. Nina stepped back, slightly breathless. Her cheeks were warm with embarrassment and excitement. "Well," she said softly, "that was unexpected. You did perfectly. That's only because you carried the entire dance." "I disagree." She tilted her head. "Oh? You trusted me." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then the crowd shifted again as people returned to their tables. Nina suddenly remembered something. "I should probably find my friend before she thinks I got lost." "Of course." She smiled politely. "Thank you for the dance, and for catching me earlier." "My pleasure." She turned to leave, then paused. "Next time," she said playfully, "I'll try not to crash into you. I'm not sure I'd mind if you did." She laughed softly and walked back into the crowd. Neither of them noticed that as Nina moved away, a small silver bracelet slipped quietly from her wrist onto the polished floor. Inside the bracelet, engraved in delicate letters, was a single name: Nina. A moment later, the tall man stepped forward and noticed the glint of silver near his shoe. He bent down and picked it up. Holding it under the light, he read the engraving slowly. Nina. Behind the dark mask, Adrian Moretti's expression changed just slightly. The name stirred a memory he had not thought about in years, and without fully understanding why, he slipped the bracelet carefully into his pocket. The applause slowly faded as the music shifted to another song, and the crowd returned to its cheerful conversations. Nina Carter slipped back into the moving sea of guests, her heart still beating faster than usual. Emily found her near the dessert table. "There you are," Emily said, eyes wide. "Where did you disappear to?" Nina reached for a glass of water, trying to calm herself. "I just bumped into someone." Emily raised an eyebrow. "You don't look like someone who just bumped into a person. You look like someone who just met a movie star." Nina laughed softly. "Relax. It was just a dance." Emily leaned closer. "A dance that half the room stopped to watch." Nina blinked. "They did not." "Oh yes, they did," Emily said confidently. Everyone noticed that mysterious masked couple suddenly dancing like something out of an old Hollywood movie. Nina shook her head. "That's ridiculous." "Well, ridiculous or not, it was impressive." Nina tried to dismiss the conversation, but her mind returned briefly to the tall man in the black tuxedo. His calm voice, the steady way he guided her through the dance, the strange feeling that he had been completely in control of the moment without ever making her uncomfortable. It was unusual, but the evening continued, and soon the moment faded into the background. Across the ballroom, Adrian Moretti watched quietly from near the bar. He held the silver bracelet in his hand. The tiny engraving caught the light again. "Nina." He turned it slowly between his fingers. "Interesting," he murmured. One of the bartenders approached. "Another drink, sir?" Adrian nodded politely. "Just whiskey." "Neat." The bartender placed the glass in front of him. Adrian took a slow sip while his mind worked. He rarely attended social events like this. The owner of Riverside Grand had been an old acquaintance, someone Adrian respected for building his business honestly over many decades. Adrian had promised he would stop by briefly, but he had not expected to meet anyone memorable tonight. Yet somehow that brief encounter with the woman named Nina lingered in his thoughts. He did not know her last name. He did not know anything about her life. And yet the name itself stirred a memory he could not fully place. After a moment, Adrian slipped the bracelet into the inside pocket of his jacket. Perhaps he would return it if he saw her again. Across the room, Nina laughed at something Emily said, completely unaware that the man she had danced with was still nearby. The band began playing a faster tune now. Some guests were dancing again, while others gathered around the buffet tables. Mr. Donnelly, the restaurant owner, climbed briefly onto the small stage to make a short speech thanking everyone for their hard work throughout the year. Nina listened politely with the others, but a strange feeling lingered in her chest. She couldn't quite explain it. Maybe it was simply the excitement of the evening, or maybe it was something else. Meanwhile, Adrian finished his drink and glanced toward the exit. He had stayed longer than expected. Business waited tomorrow. As he walked toward the door, two men near the entrance nodded respectfully to him. They wore suits but no masks. Bodyguards. They had kept a discreet distance all evening. Adrian stepped outside into the cold Manhattan night. The noise of the party faded behind him. His driver immediately opened the back door of a black sedan waiting near the curb. "Good evening, Mr. Moretti." Adrian gave a small nod as he stepped inside. "Everything quiet tonight?" he asked. "Yes, sir." The car began moving slowly down the street. Adrian leaned back against the seat and closed his eyes briefly. For most people, New Year's Eve meant celebration. For Adrian Moretti, it was simply another night in a life built on responsibility and control. He carried the weight of an entire organization, hundreds of employees, dozens of businesses, people who depended on his decisions every single day. Trust was rare in his world, and mistakes could cost lives. The city lights passed across the window as the car drove through Manhattan. Adrian reached into his pocket again. The bracelet. He examined the engraving once more. Nina. The name continued to echo faintly in his mind. Then suddenly the memory returned. 3 years ago, a file had crossed his desk. A man named Daniel Carter, suspected of cooperating with federal investigators. The report had been presented by Adrian's most trusted lieutenant, Victor Salazar. The recommendation had been clear. The man could not be allowed to testify. Adrian had approved the decision without hesitation. Betrayal inside the organization was something he never tolerated, but now something about the memory felt unfinished. Adrian opened his eyes slowly. "Driver." "Yes, sir." "Tomorrow morning, I want you to ask Marco to pull an old file for me." "What file?" "Daniel Carter." The driver glanced briefly in the mirror but said nothing. "Of course, sir." Adrian looked down at the bracelet again. Coincidences existed, but in his experience they were rarely meaningless. Meanwhile, back inside the restaurant, Nina had no idea that her quiet evening had just begun to ripple into something much larger. The celebration continued until nearly midnight. Guests counted down the final seconds of the year. 10, 9, 8. People laughed and raised their glasses. 7, 6. Emily grabbed Nina's hand. "Come on, you have to celebrate." 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. The room exploded with cheers as the new year began. Champagne corks popped. Music grew louder. People hugged and wished each other happiness for the year ahead. Nina smiled and returned the embraces around her. But as the excitement settled, she reached instinctively toward her wrist. Her smile faded. Her bracelet was gone. "Oh no," she whispered. "If that moment touched your heart, tell me in the comments. Where in the world are you watching this story from tonight? Your messages mean a lot, and I love seeing how far these stories travel. And if you enjoy emotional stories like Nina's, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and join our growing community so you never miss the next story." Emily looked at her. "What happened?" "My bracelet," Nina said quickly. "It must have fallen off." "The silver one?" "Yes. Maybe it's on the dance floor." Nina searched around the nearby tables, under chairs, near the stage, but the bracelet was nowhere to be found. She tried to hide her disappointment. "It's okay," she said finally. "It was just an old piece of jewelry, but in truth it meant more than that. Daniel had given it to her years ago, a small birthday gift. Simple, but precious." Emily placed a hand on her shoulder. "Maybe someone found it and turned it in. Maybe." But Nina had a strange feeling that the bracelet had already left the room. Far across the city, Adrian Moretti sat quietly in the back seat of his car. The bracelet rested safely in his pocket. Neither of them understood it yet, but the small silver bracelet had just connected two lives that had already been tied together by a past neither of them fully understood. And sometimes the smallest accident is the beginning of the largest truth. Morning arrived, slowly over Manhattan, pale winter light slipping between the tall buildings and touching the quiet streets below. Nina Carter woke before her alarm. For a moment she lay still, staring at the ceiling of her small apartment. The events of the previous night drifted through her mind in fragments: music, laughter, the applause after the dance, and the calm voice of the stranger behind the silver mask. Then she remembered something else. Her bracelet. Nina sat up immediately. "Great," she muttered softly. She checked the bedside table, even though she already knew it wasn't there. The silver bracelet had been on her wrist when she left home. Daniel had given it to her years ago for her birthday. A simple piece of jewelry, but one of the few things she had left that connected her to him. She sighed and pushed herself out of bed. Outside her window, the city was already alive. Taxi horns echoed faintly in the distance, and somewhere nearby a delivery truck rumbled past. New York never stayed quiet for long. After a quick shower, Nina dressed for work and tied her hair into a loose ponytail. Riverside Grand Restaurant reopened later that afternoon, and even though it was New Year's Day, the kitchen staff would already be preparing for the evening crowd. When she arrived at the restaurant, the place looked completely different from the night before. The decorations were half removed. Chairs were stacked along the walls. A few employees moved slowly through the dining area, cleaning glasses and gathering tablecloths from the celebration. Emily spotted her immediately. "You're here early," Emily said, carrying a tray of coffee mugs. Nina shrugged. "Couldn't sleep." Emily studied her face. "You're still thinking about that bracelet, aren't you?" Nina leaned against the counter. It was Daniel's gift. Emily's expression softened. "I know." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Emily said, "We checked the dance floor after everyone left. Didn't find anything." Nina nodded quietly. "It's all right. Maybe someone picked it up. Or maybe that mysterious dance partner of yours found it," Emily said teasingly. Nina rolled her eyes. "That man probably forgot I exist 5 seconds after the music stopped." Emily grinned. "You never know." Nina poured herself a cup of coffee. "Trust me, I know." But even as she said it, the memory of the dance returned clearly. The way he had guided her steps, the quiet confidence in his voice. For someone she had met only minutes earlier, the moment had felt strangely comfortable. Nina shook the thought away. She had work to do. Across the city, Adrian Moretti sat behind a wide oak desk inside his private office. The room overlooked the Hudson River, the morning sunlight reflecting off the water far below. The office itself was quiet and orderly, dark wood shelves filled with books, a large painting of the Manhattan skyline on the wall, and a single crystal decanter resting on a side table. Adrian preferred silence in the morning. It gave him time to think. Marco entered the office, carrying a thick folder. "You asked for this, sir." Adrian looked up. "Thank you." Marco placed the folder on the desk. "Daniel Carter." 3 years ago. Adrian opened it slowly. Inside were photographs, financial reports, and investigation notes from the internal inquiry conducted at the time. The final page contained Victor Salazar's recommendation. The same recommendation Adrian had approved. "Terminate immediately." Adrian leaned back slightly. Marco waited. "Something wrong, sir?" he asked carefully. Adrian didn't answer right away. Instead, he removed the bracelet from his pocket and placed it on the desk. Marco glanced at it. "A bracelet?" Adrian nodded. "I found it last night." Marco said nothing. Adrian tapped the file gently. "The sister." Marco understood immediately. "Daniel Carter had a younger sister," he said. "Nina Carter." Adrian looked at the bracelet again. "Yes." Marco crossed his arms thoughtfully. "You think the two are connected?" "I danced with her last night," Adrian said calmly. Marco raised an eyebrow. "At the party?" "Yes." "And she didn't recognize you?" Adrian allowed himself a faint smile. "Fortunately for both of us." Marco stepped closer to the desk. "What do you want to do?" Adrian closed the file slowly. "For now, nothing." Marco looked surprised. "Nothing? I want to review the case again." Marco hesitated. "Sir, that investigation was completed years ago. By Salazar," Adrian said quietly. Marco understood the implication. Victor Salazar had been Adrian's most trusted lieutenant for nearly a decade. But trust in Adrian's world was never absolute. Adrian tapped the bracelet once more. "People rarely appear in your life by accident," he said thoughtfully. Marco studied him. "You think something was missed?" "I think something was convenient." Marco nodded slowly. "What about the bracelet?" Adrian picked it up. "I'll return it." Meanwhile, Nina spent the afternoon helping prepare the restaurant for the evening service. By 6 o'clock, the dining room was once again filled with customers. The calm rhythm of work helped clear her mind, until the host approached her table. "Nina," he said quietly, "there's someone asking for you." Nina frowned. "For me?" "Yes." She walked toward the front of the restaurant, and stopped. Standing near the entrance was the tall man from the masquerade party. No mask this time. He looked exactly as she remembered. Tall, composed, wearing a dark coat over his suit. For a moment, Nina simply stared. Then recognition flashed across her face. "You," she said softly. Adrian inclined his head politely. "Good evening." Nina blinked, suddenly aware that several co-workers were watching the scene unfold. "I didn't expect to see you again." Adrian reached into his coat pocket. "I believe this belongs to you." He opened his hand. The silver bracelet rested in his palm. Nina's eyes widened. My bracelet. She stepped forward quickly. You found it? It fell during the dance. Nina took it carefully, relief washing over her face. Thank you. You have no idea how much this means. You're welcome. She hesitated before fastening it around her wrist again. I thought it was gone forever. Adrian watched her for a moment. A gift. Nina nodded. My brother gave it to me. The words hung quietly in the air between them. Adrian's expression remained calm, but his eyes darkened slightly. I see. Nina smiled politely. Well, thank you again. Adrian gave a small nod. Perhaps next time we meet, you'll be the one stepping on my shoes during another dance. Nina laughed softly. Next time I'll try not to crash into you first. Adrian turned to leave, but before he reached the door, Nina spoke again. Wait. He paused. Yes? Nina looked slightly embarrassed. I never asked your name. Adrian considered the question for a moment. Then he answered calmly. Adrian. He opened the door and stepped outside. Nina watched him leave, unaware that the name she had just heard carried a meaning that would soon change everything. Nina stood near the entrance of Riverside Grand for a long moment after the door closed behind Adrian. The winter air had rushed briefly into the restaurant when he stepped outside, leaving behind the faint smell of cold pavement and car exhaust. For some reason, the quiet confidence in his voice lingered in her thoughts. Adrian, she repeated softly to herself. Emily suddenly appeared beside her, nearly spilling a tray of glasses. Okay, Emily whispered excitedly. Who was that? Nina turned back toward the dining room. No one. Emily gave her a look. That was definitely not no one. Nina walked toward the service station, trying to return to work. He just returned something I lost. Emily followed her. The bracelet? Yes. Emily leaned against the counter. And he just happened to show up at your workplace the next day? Nina shrugged. Well, he said he found it during the dance. Emily folded her arms. And you didn't ask anything else? Like what? Emily stared at her as if the answer were obvious. Like his last name? What he does? Whether he's single? Whether he secretly owns half of Manhattan? Nina laughed quietly. I was working, Emily. You're hopeless. But Nina had already moved on to another table, greeting an older couple who were regular customers. Good evening, Mr. and Mrs. Green, she said warmly. Happy New Year. Mr. Green smiled kindly. Happy New Year, Nina. Looks like you survived the party last night. Barely, she said jokingly. The normal rhythm of the evening continued. Orders came in, plates went out, and the familiar comfort of routine slowly replaced the strange tension she had felt earlier. But somewhere in the back of her mind, the name Adrian echoed again. Across town, Adrian Moretti sat in the back seat of his car as it moved through evening traffic. Marco sat in the passenger seat, glancing occasionally at the rearview mirror. So, Marco said finally, you returned the bracelet. Adrian nodded. Yes. And nothing. Marco turned slightly. You just gave it back and left? Adrian looked out the window as the city lights passed by. She thanked me. Marco smirked. That sounds very anticlimactic. Adrian didn't respond. Marco continued. You know, most people don't get a second conversation with you. Adrian finally looked forward again. She doesn't know who I am. Marco chuckled. That's probably refreshing. Adrian's tone remained calm. It is. For a few seconds, the car was quiet. Then Marco asked carefully, did she mention her brother? Yes. Marco waited. And? She said the bracelet was a gift from him. Marco leaned back slightly. That must have been uncomfortable. Adrian's voice grew quieter. It was interesting. The car turned toward the waterfront where Adrian's office building stood overlooking the Hudson River. Marco hesitated before speaking again. You're still thinking about the Carter file? Yes. You really believe Salazar may have been wrong? Adrian's eyes narrowed slightly. In our world, mistakes rarely happen by accident. Marco understood. Victor Salazar had been the one who presented the evidence against Daniel Carter, and if that evidence had been manipulated, it meant something much more dangerous. Someone inside their own organization had lied. The car stopped outside the building. Adrian stepped out. Tomorrow, he said. I want the financial records from that year reviewed. Marco nodded. Everything? Everything. Inside the building, Adrian walked through the quiet hallway toward his office. For years, he had built his reputation on control. Control of business. Control of people. Control of information. but now a small detail from the past had resurfaced. A name, a bracelet, a woman who had no idea how closely her life had once crossed his own. Meanwhile, at the restaurant, Nina finished her shift shortly before midnight. The last customers slowly left, and the staff began cleaning for the night. Emily stretched her arms. "I'm exhausted." Nina laughed. "That's because you danced for half the party last night." Emily grabbed her coat. "So, are you going to see mysterious Adrian again?" Nina shrugged as she tied her scarf. "I doubt it. You say that, but he already showed up once. That was just to return the bracelet." Emily grinned. "Sure." They stepped outside together into the cold winter air. Snow from earlier in the week still rested in small piles along the sidewalk. The city felt quieter now. Emily waved for a taxi. "Well," she said, climbing in, "if he does come back, at least ask for his last name next time." Nina smiled. "I'll keep that in mind." The taxi drove away, leaving Nina alone on the sidewalk. She began walking toward the subway station. Her hand rested unconsciously on the bracelet now secured around her wrist. Daniel's gift. For years she had carried the quiet anger of losing him, the unanswered questions, the name everyone whispered. Adrian Moretti. She had never seen the man responsible, never spoken to him, and she certainly never imagined she would someday dance with him in the middle of a crowded ballroom. But destiny often works quietly. Across the city, Adrian stood in front of the window of his office, looking down at the river. Marco entered a few minutes later carrying another folder. "Sir," Adrian turned. "What did you find?" Marco placed the folder on the desk. "I started reviewing the financial records from the Carter case. And," Marco's expression was serious, "there are some irregularities." Adrian's eyes sharpened. "What kind of irregularities?" Marco opened the folder and slid several documents across the desk. These transactions came from Victor Salazar's accounts. Adrian studied the numbers, payments, transfers, dates that matched the timeline of Daniel Carter's execution. Marco lowered his voice. "It looks like someone was being paid." Adrian's expression darkened. "For what?" Marco answered quietly. "To make sure Daniel Carter never spoke to federal investigators." The room fell silent. For 3 years, Adrian had believed Daniel Carter was a traitor, but now the evidence suggested something far more dangerous. Someone had manipulated the truth, and the man responsible might still be standing beside him every day. Adrian closed the folder slowly. "Keep digging," he said. Marco nodded. "And Nina Carter?" Adrian looked back toward the window, the lights of Manhattan reflecting across the glass. "For now," he said calmly, "she stays out of this." But even as he spoke the words, both men understood something important. The past had already begun to move again, and sooner or later, the truth about Daniel Carter would reach the one person who had spent 3 years searching for it. Nina Carter. The next morning arrived with a pale gray sky over Manhattan and a thin layer of frost clinging to the sidewalks. Nina Carter walked toward Riverside Grand Restaurant, with her hands tucked inside the pockets of her coat. The city was quieter than usual for a weekday morning. Many people still recovering from New Year's celebrations. But the restaurant business never paused for long. Inside, the kitchen was already alive with activity. The smell of coffee and toasted bread filled the air while the chefs prepared ingredients for the day's lunch service. Nina tied on her apron and greeted the staff with a polite smile. "Morning, Nina," said Tom, the head chef, without looking up from a cutting board. "Morning, Tom." Emily appeared a moment later carrying 2 mugs of coffee. "You look like you slept better," she said, handing one to Nina. "Better than yesterday." Emily leaned against the counter. "So," she said casually, "mysterious Adrian hasn't returned yet?" Nina sighed. "It's been less than 24 hours, Emily. I'm just asking." Nina took a sip of coffee. "He returned my bracelet. That's all." Emily studied her friend for a moment. "You're curious, though." Nina hesitated. "Maybe a little." "About him?" "No," Nina replied quickly. "About how he knew where I worked," Emily shrugged. "He probably asked someone from the party." "Maybe." But Nina wasn't entirely convinced. Meanwhile, several miles away in a quiet office overlooking the Hudson River, Adrian Moretti was already deep in work. Marco stood beside the large desk as Adrian examined the financial documents again. The numbers spread across the papers told a story that Adrian did not like. "These transfers," Adrian said quietly, tapping one of the pages, "all came from Salazar's accounts?" Marco nodded. Yes, and the dates match the Carter investigation. Exactly. Adrian leaned back slightly. 3 years ago, Victor Salazar had presented the case against Daniel Carter with absolute confidence. The evidence had appeared clear. Recorded phone calls, suspicious bank deposits, and a report suggesting Daniel had contacted federal investigators. Adrian had trusted Salazar's judgment, but now the financial trail suggested something else. These payments, Adrian said slowly, look like bribes. Marco folded his arms. That's what I thought. Adrian remained silent for a moment. Bribes to whom? That's the question. Marco opened another folder. There's also something else. Adrian looked up. What? Marco slid a photograph across the desk. It showed Daniel Carter standing outside a small auto repair shop. He worked there for years, Marco explained. No criminal record, no prior investigation, nothing. Adrian studied the picture carefully. Daniel looked like an ordinary man, someone you might pass on the street without noticing. Yet his death had been ordered without hesitation. Adrian closed the folder slowly. If Salazar fabricated the evidence, he said quietly, then Carter wasn't a traitor. Marco nodded. And if Carter wasn't a traitor, someone had a reason to silence him. Adrian stood and walked toward the window. The Hudson River stretched far below, calm and gray under the winter sky. Keep investigating, Adrian said. Marco hesitated. What about Nina Carter? Adrian did not turn around. For now she stays out of this. Marco nodded, though he knew it would not remain that simple. Back at Riverside Grand Restaurant, the lunch crowd arrived earlier than expected. Nina moved quickly between tables, carrying plates and greeting customers with the warm professionalism that had made her one of the restaurant's most reliable servers. An older man seated near the window waved her over. Nina, he said kindly, how's the new year treating you? It's off to a good start, Mr. Langford. That's good to hear. She refilled his coffee and smiled politely before moving on to the next table. But halfway across the dining room, she felt a strange sensation like someone watching her. Nina glanced toward the entrance. A familiar figure stood just inside the door. Adrian. He had removed his coat and handed it to the hostess, looking entirely at ease as he scanned the room. Nina stopped for a second. Emily noticed immediately. Oh, Emily whispered behind her. Well, that didn't take long. Nina exhaled slowly. I'm working. Of course you are, Emily said, grinning. But he's definitely here for you. Adrian spotted Nina and walked toward her table. Good afternoon, he said calmly. Nina straightened slightly. Hello again. Emily quietly disappeared in the opposite direction, clearly enjoying the situation. Adrian glanced briefly around the restaurant. Busy day. It usually is after the holidays. Adrian nodded. Do you have a moment? Nina gestured toward a nearby table. I can take my break. She sat down across from him. So, she said with a small smile, did you come back because I owe you another dance lesson? Adrian's expression softened slightly. I wouldn't refuse one. Nina laughed quietly. But I assume that's not the real reason. Adrian rested his hands calmly on the table. No. Her curiosity sharpened. Then what is it? Adrian studied her for a moment before answering. Your brother. Nina's smile faded instantly. My brother? Yes. Her eyes narrowed slightly. Why are you asking about Daniel? Adrian spoke carefully. Because I believe something about his death may have been misunderstood. Nina stared at him. What does that mean? Adrian leaned back slightly. It means the story you were told may not be the full truth. The room seemed to grow quieter around them. Nina felt her pulse quicken. For 3 years, she said slowly, people have told me exactly who was responsible. Adrian held her gaze. And who was that? Nina answered without hesitation. Adrian Moretti. Adrian remained silent. Nina shook her head slightly. Funny coincidence, isn't it? Same name. Adrian's voice remained calm. Coincidences happen. But Nina's expression had changed. Something about the way he spoke, the calm confidence in his tone, suddenly felt familiar. Too familiar. She leaned forward slightly. Adrian, she said carefully. Yes? You never told me your last name. The question hung in the air between them. For a brief moment, Adrian considered the consequences of telling the truth. Then, he answered quietly, Moretti. Nina felt the world tilt. The name she had carried in anger for 3 years now sat calmly across the table from her. The man she believed had destroyed her family, and the same man who had held her during a dance only 2 nights earlier. For a moment, Nina Carter could not move. The restaurant continued around them, plates clinking, quiet conversations, the low hum of customers enjoying lunch, but everything felt distant, as if the sound had been pushed far away. Moretti. The name echoed in her head. Across the table, Adrian Moretti sat perfectly still. He watched her carefully, not with hostility, not with fear, but with a calm patience that somehow made the moment even more unsettling. Nina finally spoke. "You're joking." Her voice was quiet but strained. Adrian did not smile. "No." Nina leaned back slowly in her chair. The memories came rushing forward all at once. The whispered conversations after Daniel's death. The police report that seemed incomplete. The name everyone in the neighborhood avoided saying too loudly. Adrian Moretti, the man sitting across from her now. Her eyes searched his face, trying to reconcile the calm stranger she had danced with and the man she had imagined for years. "That's impossible," she said. Adrian's voice remained steady. "Why?" "Because—" Nina struggled for the words. "Because the man responsible for my brother's death wouldn't be sitting here calmly having lunch." Adrian folded his hands on the table. "You're assuming the story you heard was accurate." Nina laughed once, but there was no humor in it. "Everyone said the same thing. Everyone," Adrian repeated quietly, "is not always correct." Her eyes flashed. "Are you telling me Daniel wasn't killed by your organization?" Adrian didn't look away. "I'm telling you the situation may not have been what it appeared." Nina stared at him. "For 3 years I've believed you ordered his death." "I know." The simple answer unsettled her. "You know?" "Yes." "Then why would you sit here and tell me it's misunderstood?" Adrian leaned slightly forward. "Because I'm starting to believe it was." Nina shook her head, disbelief written across her face. "That makes no sense." Adrian's tone softened slightly. 3 years ago, I was given evidence that your brother was working with federal investigators. He would never do that. That's what I'm trying to determine." Nina crossed her arms. "And what suddenly made you curious?" Adrian paused briefly. "A coincidence." She raised an eyebrow. "You mean the bracelet?" "Yes." "That's ridiculous." "Maybe," Adrian admitted. "But sometimes small details reopen old questions." Nina leaned back again, trying to control the mixture of anger and confusion building inside her. "You approved his execution." Adrian did not deny it. "Yes." Her voice rose slightly. "And now you want to tell me you're not sure it was justified?" "I'm saying the evidence may have been manipulated." Nina's eyes narrowed. "By who?" Adrian answered carefully. "Victor Salazar." The name was unfamiliar to her. "Who is that?" "My second in command." Nina stared at him. "You're saying someone inside your own organization lied to you?" "It's possible." "And you didn't notice for 3 years?" Adrian accepted the accusation calmly. "In my world, information travels through many hands." Nina shook her head again. "So let me understand this," she said slowly. "You're telling me my brother might have been innocent?" "Yes. And you only realized this after dancing with me at a party." Adrian met her gaze. "After noticing inconsistencies in the investigation." She laughed again, this time bitterly. "That doesn't bring him back." "No," Adrian said quietly. "It doesn't." For a few seconds the table fell silent. Customers continued eating around them, completely unaware that a conversation capable of changing both their lives was happening only a few feet away. Finally Nina spoke again. "If what you're saying is true, why tell me?" Adrian answered without hesitation. "Because you deserve to know the truth." Her voice hardened. "And if you're wrong, then I will tell you that as well." Nina looked down at the bracelet around her wrist. Daniel's gift, a small piece of silver that had survived 3 years of grief. When she looked back up, her eyes were calmer, but still guarded. "What exactly are you investigating?" Adrian considered how much he should reveal. "Financial records from the time of your brother's death. And there were payments connected to the investigation." "Payments?" "Bribes." Nina's expression shifted. "For what?" "To make sure your brother never testified." Her breath caught slightly. "You're saying someone wanted him silenced?" "Yes." "And you didn't know that before?" "No." Nina sat very still. For years she had imagined a single villain responsible for Daniel's death. Now the story was becoming far more complicated. Why would someone inside your organization want him dead if he wasn't actually betraying you? Adrian answered quietly. "Because he may have discovered something." "What?" "That's what I'm trying to find out." Nina's mind raced. If Daniel wasn't the traitor, Then someone else was. Exactly. She leaned forward again. And if you find out who, Adrian's voice became colder, then that person will answer for it. Nina studied him carefully. The calm control he carried was unmistakable. This was not the man she had imagined in her anger. This man was something more complex, and that frightened her more than simple hatred. After a moment she asked quietly, "Why should I trust you?" Adrian did not answer immediately. Finally he said, "You shouldn't." That surprised her. "But you should pay attention to what happens next." Nina frowned slightly. "What does that mean?" "It means the truth will surface soon." He stood from the table. "I'll contact you when I know more." Nina rose as well. "Wait." Adrian paused. "If you're wrong," she said firmly, "if this is some kind of manipulation." "It isn't." She held his gaze. "For your sake, I hope not." Adrian nodded once. Then he turned and walked toward the restaurant exit. Nina remained standing beside the table. Her heart was still racing. 3 years of anger had just been shaken by a single conversation, and for the first time since Daniel died, a terrifying possibility had entered her mind. Maybe the story she believed was never the real one. Across the street, Adrian stepped into the waiting black sedan. Marco looked back from the passenger seat. "Well?" Adrian closed the door. "She knows." Marco's eyebrows rose. "You told her?" "Yes." Marco leaned back slowly. "That's going to complicate things." Adrian stared out the window toward the restaurant where Nina still stood inside. "It already has." Nina stood by the table long after Adrian Moretti had left the restaurant. The noise of the dining room slowly returned to her ears, the murmur of conversations, the clink of silverware against plates, the quiet laughter of customers finishing their meals, but none of it felt real. Her mind was still replaying the same moment over and over. Moretti. For 3 years she had carried that name like a weight on her chest. Now the man himself had sat across from her, speaking calmly about mistakes, evidence, and the possibility that Daniel had been innocent. Emily approached carefully. "You look like someone just told you the earth is flat," she said. Nina blinked, returning to the present. "It's worse than that." Emily leaned closer. "What happened?" Nina lowered her voice. "The man who returned my bracelet." "Adrian?" "Yes." Emily waited. "Well?" Nina swallowed. "His last name is Moretti." Emily froze. "The Moretti?" Nina nodded slowly. Emily looked toward the restaurant door instinctively, as if expecting the man to walk back in. "You're telling me the Adrian Moretti just sat at that table and talked to you like a normal customer?" "Yes." Emily shook her head in disbelief. "And you're still standing here calmly?" "I'm not calm," Nina said quietly. "What did he want?" Nina hesitated. "He said Daniel might have been innocent." Emily's eyes widened. "What?" "He said someone inside his organization may have manipulated the investigation." Emily sat down in the chair Adrian had just vacated. "That's a lot to process." Nina nodded. "For 3 years I thought I knew exactly what happened. And now? Now I don't know anything." Across the city, Adrian returned to his office building just as the afternoon sun began to fade behind the skyline. Marco followed him into the office carrying several new documents. "I made a few calls after our conversation this morning," Marco said. Adrian removed his coat and placed it over the back of a chair. "And?" Marco opened the folder. The financial transfers connected to Salazar didn't stop with the Carter case. Adrian looked up. "They continued?" "For months." Marco laid the papers across the desk. "These payments went to 3 different accounts, all offshore." Adrian studied the numbers carefully. "How much money?" "Nearly $4 million. Adrian's expression hardened slightly. "That's not a small operation." "No," Marco agreed. "It suggests something bigger." Adrian leaned back in his chair. If Salazar fabricated the evidence against Carter, he must have had a reason. Marco nodded. "Money. Or protection." Marco's eyes narrowed slightly. "You think Carter discovered something?" "It's possible." Marco hesitated before asking the next question. "If that's true, do we tell Nina?" Adrian shook his head slowly. "Not yet. She's already involved." "I know." Marco looked uneasy. "Salazar won't react well if he realizes we're digging into the past." Adrian's voice remained calm. "He doesn't know." Marco glanced at the documents again. "Not yet." Adrian closed the folder. "Continue tracing the payments." Marco nodded, but as he turned to leave, he paused. "There's one more thing." Adrian raised an eyebrow. "What?" "Salazar requested a meeting tomorrow morning." Adrian's expression did not change. About what? He didn't say. Adrian leaned back slightly. Interesting timing. Marco crossed his arms. You think he suspects something? Maybe. And if he does? Adrian's voice was quiet but firm. Then we'll know soon enough. Meanwhile, Nina finished her shift later that evening, though her mind was far from focused on work. The conversation with Adrian had unsettled everything she believed about Daniel's death. She walked slowly toward the subway station, the cold night air brushing against her face. The city lights reflected off the wet pavement, and taxis passed in a steady stream along the avenue. Her hand rested unconsciously on the bracelet again. Daniel's gift. For years it had been a reminder of what she lost. Now it had become something else. A question: had Daniel really betrayed someone powerful enough to order his death? Or had he discovered something he wasn't meant to see? Nina stopped walking. The thought frightened her. If Adrian Moretti was telling the truth, then the man responsible for Daniel's death might still be out there. Still powerful. Still dangerous. Back in his office, Adrian stood near the window overlooking the river. The sky had turned dark, and the lights of Manhattan glittered across the water. Marco entered again. Sir, Adrian turned. Yes, I found something else. Marco placed a photograph on the desk. It showed Daniel Carter standing beside another man outside the auto repair shop where he worked. Adrian studied the image. Who's the second man? Marco pointed. That's Victor Salazar. Adrian's eyes narrowed. So Salazar knew Carter personally? Yes, before the investigation even started. Marco nodded. That's what it looks like. The room grew very quiet. Adrian slowly placed the photograph back on the desk. For 3 years, he said quietly, we believed Carter betrayed us. Marco folded his arms. But now it looks like Salazar may have known him long before that. Adrian's voice grew colder, which means the entire investigation may have been built on a lie. Marco looked toward the window. And if Salazar realizes we're uncovering that lie? Adrian answered without hesitation. Then he'll try to stop us. Marco exhaled slowly. That could get dangerous. Adrian turned back toward the desk. It already is. Outside, the city continued its restless rhythm, unaware that a quiet investigation had just begun, one that threatened to expose secrets buried for 3 years. And somewhere in Manhattan, Nina Carter was unknowingly walking deeper into the same truth. The next morning, Manhattan woke beneath a pale winter sun that barely warmed the cold streets. Traffic moved slowly across the bridges, and the city carried on with its usual rhythm. But inside the glass office tower overlooking the Hudson River, the atmosphere felt heavier than usual. Adrian Moretti arrived early. He preferred quiet mornings, especially when difficult decisions were approaching. His office remained silent except for the faint ticking of a wall clock and the distant hum of traffic far below. On the desk in front of him lay the photograph Marco had discovered the night before. Daniel Carter, standing beside Victor Salazar. Adrian studied the image again. 3 years ago, he had trusted Salazar's report without hesitation. Salazar had claimed Daniel Carter was secretly working with federal investigators, feeding them information about Moretti operations. In Adrian's world, betrayal meant only one outcome, but now the photograph suggested something entirely different. Salazar and Carter had known each other long before the accusation, which meant Salazar had lied about at least one thing. A quiet knock interrupted Adrian's thoughts. Marco stepped into the office. He's here. Adrian didn't need to ask who. Victor Salazar rarely visited the office without warning. Send him in. Marco nodded and stepped aside. A moment later, Victor Salazar entered the room. Salazar was a tall man in his late 50s with silver hair and sharp features that carried the confidence of someone who had spent decades in positions of authority. His suit was expensive but understated, and his eyes immediately scanned the room the way experienced men often did. Adrian, Salazar said with a polite smile. Happy New Year. Adrian stood and offered a handshake. Victor, Salazar sat down across the desk without being invited, which in itself was unusual. Normally, Salazar observed a strict formality when meeting Adrian. I hope I'm not interrupting anything, Salazar said casually. Not at all. Salazar glanced briefly at Marco. May we speak privately? Adrian considered the request for a moment. It's fine. Marco stays. Salazar shrugged. Of course. For a few seconds, no one spoke. The tension in the room felt subtle but unmistakable. Finally, Salazar leaned back slightly. I've been reviewing some older financial reports, he said. Something caught my attention. Adrian remained calm. What kind of reports? Salazar smiled faintly. The Carter investigation. Marco's eyes flicked toward Adrian for a fraction of a second. Adrian kept his expression neutral. That case was closed 3 years ago. Yes, Salazar said. But certain details resurfaced during an audit. And Salazar folded his hands. I was wondering why anyone would be reopening it. Adrian leaned back slowly in his chair. What makes you think someone is? Salazar's eyes narrowed just slightly. Because I know how our systems work. Marco remained silent beside the desk. Salazar continued. Files don't move unless someone requests them. Adrian's voice stayed calm. You're assuming quite a lot. Salazar chuckled softly. Experience teaches a man to recognize patterns. He leaned forward slightly. Tell me, Adrian, why would anyone want to revisit the Carter case after all this time? Adrian studied him carefully. Curiosity? Salazar raised an eyebrow. That's unusual in our business. Is it? Salazar smiled again, but this time the expression did not reach his eyes. Curiosity tends to cause problems. Adrian's voice remained steady. So does dishonesty. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Salazar's gaze sharpened. Are you suggesting something? Adrian picked up the photograph from the desk and slid it across the table. Salazar looked down at it. For a brief moment, his expression changed. Only slightly, but Adrian noticed. You knew Daniel Carter, Adrian said calmly. Salazar looked back up. Yes. You told me you had never met him before the investigation. Salazar shrugged. I may have forgotten. That's a significant detail to forget. Salazar's tone hardened slightly. He worked at a repair shop we occasionally used. It wasn't important. Adrian leaned forward. But important enough that you personally handled the investigation. Salazar's smile faded. Someone had to. Did he discover something he wasn't supposed to? Salazar stood slowly. I think this conversation is heading in an unnecessary direction. Adrian remained seated. Sit down, Victor. For the first time in many years, Salazar hesitated before obeying. Adrian's voice became colder. I'm reviewing financial records from that year. Salazar's eyes narrowed. And there were payments made from your accounts. Business expenses. $4 million worth? Salazar said nothing. Marco stepped forward slightly. We traced the accounts, he said. They connect to people involved in the Carter case. Salazar looked at him sharply. You should be careful making accusations. Marco didn't move. We're careful with facts. Salazar turned back toward Adrian. You're trusting an accountant over the man who's been loyal to you for 15 years? Adrian's reply was quiet. I'm trusting the evidence. For several seconds, the room remained completely silent. Then Salazar leaned back slowly in his chair. You think Carter was innocent. I think the truth hasn't been told. Salazar laughed once, but it sounded forced. You're letting emotion cloud your judgment. Adrian's eyes hardened. This has nothing to do with emotion. Then why dig up the past? Adrian answered without hesitation. Because someone lied to me. Salazar stared at him. And you think that someone is me? Adrian did not respond. Salazar stood again. Well, he said coldly. I hope your curiosity doesn't create problems for all of us. Adrian rose as well. If it does, we'll deal with them. Salazar walked toward the door. But before leaving, he turned back once more. Be careful, Adrian, he said quietly. Some questions are better left unanswered. Then he left the office. The door closed behind him. Marco exhaled slowly. That went well. Adrian looked down at the photograph of Daniel Carter. No, he said quietly. That confirmed everything. Marco frowned. You're sure? Adrian nodded. He's afraid. Marco crossed his arms. And when a man like Salazar gets afraid, Adrian's voice turned calm and cold. He makes mistakes. Outside the building, the winter wind swept across the streets of Manhattan. Somewhere in the city, Nina Carter continued her ordinary day. Unaware that the investigation into her brother's death had just reached its most dangerous moment, and Victor Salazar now knew one thing with absolute certainty. Adrian Moretti was getting too close to the truth. The following evening, the city moved beneath a cold winter sky. Lights glowing across Manhattan as people hurried home from work or filled restaurants with quiet conversation. To most of them, it was simply another ordinary night. But for Adrian Moretti, it was the moment when 3 years of silence were finally coming to an end. Inside his office overlooking the Hudson River, Adrian stood beside the window, watching the reflection of city lights ripple across the dark water. Marco entered quietly. "Everything's ready." Adrian turned. "You're certain?" Marco nodded. "We verified the transfers again. The accounts trace directly to Salazar's offshore companies, and the witness we found is waiting downstairs." Adrian's expression remained calm, but the tension in his eyes had sharpened. "Good." Marco hesitated. "There's one more thing." Adrian waited. "I think Salazar knows we've confirmed it." Adrian nodded slowly. "I expected that." Marco crossed his arms. "He's dangerous when he feels cornered." Adrian picked up the photograph of Daniel Carter from the desk one last time. "Then tonight we end this." Across town, Nina Carter finished her shift at Riverside Grand Restaurant. The dining room had been busy all evening, and the long hours had given her little time to think. But the moment she stepped outside into the cold air, the memories returned. Adrian Moretti, his calm voice, the possibility that Daniel had not betrayed anyone. For 3 years, Nina had believed she knew exactly who had destroyed her family. Now the truth was beginning to shift beneath her feet. As she started walking toward the subway station, a black sedan slowly pulled to the curb beside her. The window lowered. "Nina." She stopped immediately. Adrian sat inside the car. "Can we talk?" he asked. She hesitated only a second before opening the door and stepping inside. The car pulled back into traffic. Neither of them spoke for several moments. Finally, Nina broke the silence. "You found something?" Adrian nodded. "Yes." Her hands tightened slightly in her coat pockets. "What is it?" Adrian spoke carefully. "Your brother wasn't a traitor." The words hung in the air between them. Nina felt her throat tighten. "How do you know?" "We traced the financial records connected to the investigation. The payments came from Victor Salazar." "Your lieutenant?" "Yes." Nina frowned. "Why would he frame Daniel?" Adrian answered quietly. "Because Daniel discovered something he shouldn't have." "What?" "Salazar had been stealing from the organization for years." Nina blinked. "Stealing? Millions of dollars. And Daniel found out?" Adrian nodded. "He repaired vehicles for several of our businesses. One of those vehicles contained financial records Salazar had hidden." Nina stared at him. "So Daniel wasn't working with federal investigators?" "No." "What about the recordings you mentioned before?" "Fabricated." Nina felt a rush of emotions, relief, anger, grief, all colliding at once. "For 3 years," she whispered. "Everyone believed he betrayed someone." Adrian's voice softened. "I believed it too." Nina looked down at the bracelet around her wrist. "Daniel's gift. I spent 3 years hating you." Adrian didn't argue. "I understand." The car slowed to a stop outside Adrian's office building. "We're not finished yet," Adrian said. "What do you mean?" "Salazar knows we uncovered the truth." Nina's eyes widened. "And?" "He won't let it come out quietly." Inside the building, Marco waited near the elevator. He greeted them with a quick nod. "He's here." Nina looked confused. "Salazar?" Marco nodded. "He agreed to meet." Adrian turned to Nina. "You don't have to be part of this." She shook her head immediately. "This is about my brother." Adrian studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Stay close." They entered the office together. Victor Salazar stood near the window, his back turned as he looked out across the dark river. When he heard the door open, he turned slowly. His eyes moved from Adrian to Marco and finally to Nina. "Well," Salazar said quietly, "this is unexpected." Adrian stepped forward. "It's over, Victor." Salazar smiled faintly. "Is it?" Adrian placed the financial documents on the desk. "We know about the stolen money." Salazar didn't move. "We know you framed Daniel Carter." For the first time, Salazar's expression hardened. "You're making a mistake." Adrian slid the photograph across the desk. "You knew him before the investigation." Salazar glanced at the photo. "That proves nothing." Marco stepped forward. "The financial transfers prove everything." Salazar looked from one man to the other. "And what exactly do you plan to do with this information?" Adrian's voice was calm. "You're finished." Salazar laughed once. "You think the organization will choose you over me?" "They already have." Salazar's eyes shifted toward Nina. "So this is about her." Adrian didn't respond. Salazar shook his head slowly. "For 3 years, the truth stayed buried. And now you dig it up because of a coincidence." Nina finally spoke. "My brother was innocent." Salazar studied her coldly. "Your brother was unlucky." The words cut through the room. Adrian's voice dropped. Careful. Salazar smiled. He found something he didn't understand. That happens sometimes. Nina's hands trembled slightly. You killed him. Salazar shrugged. I solved a problem. Before anyone could react, Salazar suddenly reached into his jacket. Marco moved instantly. Don't. Salazar froze as Marco's pistol appeared in his hand. The room fell silent. Salazar slowly raised his empty hands. I see we've reached the dramatic part of the evening. Adrian stepped closer. This ends now. Salazar's expression changed. For the first time, real defeat appeared in his eyes. You know, he said quietly, power doesn't last forever. Adrian answered calmly. No, but truth does. Minutes later, security arrived to escort Salazar out of the building. The investigation that followed would expose years of corruption inside the organization, and Daniel Carter's name would finally be cleared. Later that night, Nina stood on the same rooftop terrace outside Adrian's office where the river stretched quietly beneath the winter sky. The cold wind brushed her hair as she looked out across the city. Adrian joined her a moment later. It's done, he said. Nina nodded slowly. For 3 years I thought I knew who destroyed my family. Adrian stood beside her. I'm sorry it took this long. She looked down at the bracelet on her wrist. He would have liked the view from here. Adrian smiled faintly. He sounded like a good man. He was. For a moment they simply stood in silence. Then Nina looked at him. You know something strange? What? If I hadn't crashed into you at that party, none of this would have happened. Adrian chuckled softly. Sometimes the smallest accidents change everything. Nina smiled, and for the first time in 3 years, the weight she had carried finally began to lift. The truth about Daniel Carter had been buried in lies, but truth has a way of resurfacing quietly, patiently, and often when we least expect it. Sometimes it begins with an old investigation, sometimes with a single question, and sometimes with a lost bracelet on a crowded dance floor. This story reminds us that the truth is often more complicated than the version we first believe. For years, Nina carried anger and grief because she thought she knew who was responsible for her brother's death. But when the truth finally surfaced, she learned that assumptions can hide deeper injustices. The lesson is that real justice requires patience, courage, and the willingness to question what everyone else accepts as fact. Sometimes the greatest act of strength is not revenge, but the pursuit of truth. And in the end, honesty and integrity have the power to restore dignity to those who were wronged. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.